Today we're going to take a look at a pretty down the middle LBO, and just to jump right into the prompt here, which is the starting point for any paper LBO, we have a purchase price of $150 million, so the entry EV is $150 million. The deal at entry will be funded with 50% debt, 50% equity. The company generates $15 million of EBITDA on an LTM basis as of the close, and the EBITDA is going to grow at $2 million per year over the life of the deal. And then the other information we're given here is that this business requires $5 million a year in CapEx, that there's no net working capital requirement and no taxes, just for simplicity's sake. And then finally, the interest rate on the debt is 10%, and the goal here is to figure out what the approximate IRR is for this LBO. And what we're going to walk through here is a few steps that you always need to walk through for any given paper LBO, but as I'll show you, there's a bunch of shortcuts that you can take that can make this relatively easy. Now, the first thing to tackle when you get into a paper LBO is just organizing your information, and the admittedly silly mnemonic that we use here is PD, REIT, CDN. So purchase price, debt, revenue, EBITDA, interest and taxes, and then CapEx, D&A, and net working capital. And the reason we use that is to just make sure that we have all the major pieces that we need for any given paper LBO. So to jump right in here, for this particular paper LBO, we know that the purchase price is $150. Note that I'm not putting in the currency symbols here because in a paper LBO, I just want to move quickly and keep everything neat and clean and fast. And then the debt is going to be half of the purchase price in this case. So the debt is going to be $75 million. The revenue is not relevant in this case. It wasn't given. And then the EBITDA is $15 million, but it's going to grow at $2 million per year, every year over the life of the LBO, and it's $15 million on an LTM basis. The interest is going to be 10% on the $75 million of debt, so that's going to be $7.5 million of interest every year. And then from there, the taxes are zero because we're keeping it simple here for this LBO. We have $5 million of CapEx. Our D&A is zero because it wasn't given. And then our net working capital was assumed to be zero as well. So once again, we have a pretty simple paper LBO here. And with all of the organization completed, we are going to now move on to the sources and uses. Now, when you're putting together a paper LBO, I always like to keep things simple. So we have an S for sources, U for uses. There's no reason to write the whole thing out. And I always recommend that you start at the uses side of things and then work your way to the sources. It's always better to figure out what you paid for and then figure out how you paid for it. So in this case, we have a purchase price, an enterprise value of $150. And then a total uses of $150 because there's no fees or anything else to handle here. And as we saw, we have $75 of debt. So if we're purchasing something for $150 and we have $75 of debt, that means that the remainder has to be funded with equity. So we have $75 of equity for a total of $150. And that completes the sources and uses. Now that we've completed the sources and uses, let's move ahead to the free cash flow calculations. And as we'll see here, there are a few shortcuts that we can take advantage of to really cut down the number of calculations that we need to make here relative to a typical paper LBO. So to begin with here, again, we're starting with 15 of EBITDA, and the EBITDA is going to grow by $2 million per year. So I'm going to start here by just carrying EBITDA out every year to the end. So it's 17, and then 19, then 21, 23, and then 25. Now, in a normal paper LBO or a more extensive paper LBO, you'd work through every single year and all the bits and pieces here. But we're going to work through year one, and as I'll show you, that's really more than enough with the given information that we have. So to work down year one, we have 0 of D&A. We have $7.5 million of interest expense. So we're going to pull out $7.5 million, which means, and I'll shrink that down just a little bit to make it smaller. From there, we have $9.5 of EBT. Now we have no taxes, so there's nothing to handle in the tax realm. $9.5 of net income, 0 D&A. Our CapEx is -5. So we have a -5 here. And since I'm putting decimals in here, why not make it 5.0? We have no working capital here. And then from there, we have 4.5 of free cash flow. Now, with a typical paper LBO, if you're working through all the bits and pieces, you go through every single year here. But if you look at this, the interest is going to be the same all the way across. And all the other items, except for CapEx, are 0. And CapEx is also going to be the same every year across. And EBITDA is just going up by $2 million per year. So what we can do here to shortcut this is say, okay, well, the free cash flow is just going to go up by $2 million per year. So 6.5, 8.5, 10.5, and then 12.5. And then with that all laid out, we can quickly get to the free cash flow here because it's 4 plus 6 is 10, then 18, 28, 38, 40 of cash flow. And then we've got all the 0.5s here. 0.5 times 5 is 2.5. So we have a total of 42.5 of free cash flow. And so now we've worked through all the pieces here. And again, we found a little shortcut that saves us a lot of time. And the bigger point to make here is that anytime you're working through a paper LBO, you want to look for these little shortcuts and paths of least resistance so you can maneuver through it in a more thoughtful and effective way and also just crank through fewer numbers when and where it's possible. It's not always possible in every paper LBO, but in this case, there's a clear shortcut that makes everything a lot easier if you're thoughtful about it. So now at this point, we have the exit EBITDA, and we have the total cash flow generated over the life of the LBO. With that in hand, we can move ahead to the exit analysis. Now we can jump into the final set of steps here, which is our exit analysis and ultimately the returns analysis. So to jump right into this, I have 25 million of EBITDA at exit, as we saw in the prior step. The entry multiple was 150 over 15, so a 10 times multiple. And in the absence of other information, we would generally assume that the exit multiple is going to be the same. That's always a good thing to clarify, by the way, as you're going through any paper LBO. Just say, I'm going to assume that the entry multiple and the exit multiple are consistent. Just want to make sure that's okay. 9 times out of 10, maybe even 10 times out of 10, people will just say, okay. Then from there, we have the exit EV of 250 million. So from there, we have to calculate our net debt at exit, which is going to be the 75 million of debt that we started with, less the 42.5 million of cash flow that we generated. So that's going to be 32.5 million of debt at exit, which means that the exit equity is going to be 217.5 million. Now our entry equity is 75. You could get super precise here and ultimately calculate out the MOIC, which is going to be right around 2.9x here. But the easier way to do this is to say, okay, well, 75 times 3 is going to be 225. So 150 plus 75 gets you to 225. And what we're looking at here is just under 225, so just under 3 times. So what I would say here is that this is approximately 3 times. And if you look at our table down below, which is the go-to table for LBOs, the reminder here is that for a 5-year deal, 2 times is 15% IRR, 2.5 is 20, and then 2.5 is 25, and you can roughly approximate in between. The IRR is going to be just below our 3x mark, and the real number is about 24% IRR. So if we wanted to be precise, we could, but for the sake of a paper LBO, the whole idea here is really just to be approximate, or at least as close as possible as you can be. And in this case, I would simply say the MOIC is just under 3 times, so it's just under 25%, so let's call it a 24% IRR. And so that's the full walkthrough of this paper LBO from front to back.